German Shepherd freezes trying to save her almost dead puppy. What the rescuer did left all in tears. James Coleman sat in the dim glow of his cabin's fireplace, the soft crackling of the logs the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Outside, the winter storm howled like a wild beast, rattling the window panes and smothering the world in an unyielding shroud of snow. It had been months since the quiet became his only companion. Ever since Emily passed, the house had grown still, the laughter and warmth that once filled it replaced by an ache he couldn't shake. James spent most evenings like this, nursing a cup of coffee that always went cold and staring into the flames, lost in thoughts of what was and what could never be again. The blizzard raging outside was fierce, even by Snowfield standards, and James resigned himself to another long, lonely night. Then came the sound, a faint scratching, barely audible over the wind. At first, James thought it might be the groan of a branch heavy with ice or the scrape of snow against the cabin. But there it was again, soft and persistent, accompanied by a weak, almost inaudible whimper. He froze, his mug hovering midair, straining to hear over the roar of the storm. When the sound came a third time, clearer and more desperate, James set down the mug, grabbed his coat from the hook by the door, and stepped into his boots. The icy air slammed into him as he opened the door, the wind slicing through his flannel shirt and biting at his skin. He squinted into the white void, the beam of his porch light barely cutting through the swirling snow. Then he saw it, a hunched figure trembling on the edge of the porch, almost buried in the mounting drifts. "Hey there," James called softly, though his voice was carried away by the wind. He approached slowly, careful not to startle whatever it was. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a dog, thin, soaked, and shivering violently. She looked up at him with pleading amber eyes, her breath forming clouds as she let out another faint whimper. In front of her, barely visible against the snow, was a tiny bundle, unmoving save for the faintest rise and fall of its fragile chest. James's heart clenched. He knelt in the snow, ignoring the cold that seeped into his jeans, and held out a hand. "It's okay, girl," he murmured, his voice gentle. "I won't hurt you." The dog didn't move, her body trembling too much to resist as James slid closer. Her fur was a rich tan under the ice and grime, her ribs stark against her sides. James reached out tentatively, his hand brushing her matted fur. She flinched but didn't retreat, as though she lacked the strength. Her gaze flicked between James and the small pup, then back again, as if begging him to do something. James scooped up the puppy first, cradling the tiny creature in his hands. It was ice cold and barely stirring, its dark fur wet and clumped. James tucked the pup into his coat, pressing it against his chest to share his warmth, before turning back to the mother. "You too," he said, sliding his arms under her frail body. She let out a soft, pitiful whine, but didn't resist as he lifted her. The wind fought him every step back to the cabin, but James held tight to the dog and her pup, shielding them from the worst of the storm. By the time he got them inside and kicked the door shut, his hands were trembling as much from the cold as from urgency. He laid the mother dog on the softest throw blanket he could find and set the puppy beside her, then grabbed another blanket to drape over them. Kneeling by the fireplace, James added more wood, coaxing the flames higher until the room was bathed in warmth. The dog shifted slightly, pulling the blanket closer with her nose as her puppy burrowed against her side. James fetched a bowl of lukewarm water and placed it in front of her. "Drink," he urged softly. The dog hesitated, her eyes flicking between James and the bowl, before finally lowering her head to lap at the water. James sat back on his heels, watching her closely. She was thin, far thinner than any dog should be in winter, and her fur bore the marks of a hard journey, scratches, matted patches, and a roughness that spoke of neglect. He wondered how long she'd been out there, how she'd survived the storm at all, and why had she chosen his door. The puppy let out a small cry, a weak sound that barely carried. The mother dog nudged it closer with her nose, licking its head with deliberate care. James felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched. This dog, this creature who looked as though she'd known nothing but hardship, still had enough love in her to care for her pup. "You're stronger than I'd be," he said softly. She glanced at him, her amber eyes meeting his for a moment, before she returned her attention to the puppy. James didn't think she understood his words, but something in her gaze made him feel as though she understood his intent. As the hours stretched on, James stayed close, ensuring the fire never waned and checking on the pair. He rummaged through the kitchen for something they could eat, settling on some plain boiled chicken he had prepared for himself. He shredded it into small pieces and offered it to the mother. She sniffed cautiously before wolfing it down, her hunger overriding any hesitation. James smiled faintly. "That's a start," he murmured. He decided then that she needed a name. "Grace," he said aloud. "It suits you." The dog's ears twitched at the sound, though her focus remained on her puppy. James chuckled softly, the sound strange in his own ears after so long without laughter. The puppy stirred, its small legs kicking weakly against the blanket. "And you," James said, gently stroking its soft fur, "you'll be Chance, because you deserve one." He felt a warmth bloom in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire, a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. That night, as the storm raged on outside, James sat by the fire with Grace and Chance, his solitary world beginning to feel just a little less empty. The morning light filtered weakly through the frost-covered windows of the cabin, casting a pale glow over the room. The storm had subsided overnight, leaving the world outside blanketed in pristine white snow. Inside, the fire still crackled gently, its warmth wrapping the small space in a cocoon of comfort. James stirred from his spot on the couch, where he'd spent the night keeping an eye on his unexpected guests. Grace and Chance lay curled together near the hearth, the soft rise and fall of their breathing the only movement in the stillness. James stretched, his joints stiff from sleeping in the awkward position, but he didn't mind. Something about the sight of the two dogs, peaceful and safe, filled a corner of his heart he hadn't realized was so empty. As he moved to stoke the fire, Grace's ears twitched and her amber eyes opened cautiously. Her gaze found him, and for a moment, she didn't move, her body tense and her expression guarded. James kept his movements slow, careful not to startle her. "Morning, Grace," he said softly, his voice carrying the warmth of someone unused to company, but eager to offer kindness. He knelt by the fire, adding another log and coaxing the flames to life. Grace watched him intently, her head resting on her paws, her gaze flicking to Chance as the puppy let out a tiny yawn and squirmed closer to her side. James smiled. "Looks like someone's getting stronger," he murmured, noting how Chance's small legs kicked slightly against the blanket. After ensuring the fire was steady, James retreated to the kitchen, leaving Grace and Chance to rest. He rummaged through the pantry, searching for something suitable for them. Boiled chicken again, he decided. It wasn't much, but it would do. As he prepared the food, he thought about the night before, the storm, and the moment he'd found them on his porch. It felt almost surreal. For months, his life had been a cycle of solitude, his days blending into one another without meaning. Now, in the span of a single night, everything had shifted. He couldn't pinpoint why, but the thought of Grace and Chance relying on him gave him a sense of purpose that had been absent for so long. When he returned to the living room with the food, Grace was sitting up, her body still thin and frail, but her posture more alert. She watched him approach, her eyes wary but not hostile. James crouched a few feet away, placing the small plate of chicken on the floor. "Here you go, girl," he said gently, sitting back on his heels. Grace hesitated, her nose twitching as she caught the scent of the food. Slowly, cautiously, she inched forward, her movements deliberate and measured. James remained still, his heart aching at the sight of her hesitance. She reached the plate and sniffed it before taking a small bite, then another. Satisfied that she was eating, James leaned back against the couch, giving her space. Chance, still nestled in the blanket, let out a small, curious squeak, his tiny nose twitching as he picked up the scent of the food. Grace paused, glancing at her pup, then nudged a small piece of chicken toward him with her nose. The gesture was so tender, so instinctively maternal, that James felt his throat tighten. As the morning wore on, James began to see glimpses of Grace's personality emerge. She was cautious but attentive, her ears constantly swiveling toward every sound, her eyes sharp and watchful. She moved with a quiet grace, appropriate for her name, always staying close to Chance, her protective instincts unshakable. Chance, on the other hand, was beginning to show signs of the playful curiosity typical of a puppy. His small legs wobbled as he attempted to explore the blanket, his movements clumsy but determined. Each time he strayed too far, Grace would gently nudge him back, her gaze never leaving him. James found himself smiling more often than he had in years, the sight of their interactions bringing a warmth that no fire could match. By midday, James decided to test the boundaries of Grace's trust. He grabbed his coat and boots, preparing to step outside and gather more firewood. "You stay here, okay?" he said, glancing at Grace. Her ears perked up at the sound of his voice, but she made no move to follow him as he opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The world outside was a stark contrast to the cozy warmth of the cabin. Snow lay heavy on the ground, the trees glistening with ice under the pale winter sun. The air was crisp and biting, but James didn't mind. He worked quickly, stacking logs in his arms and savoring the clean, sharp scent of the forest. As he turned to head back inside, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. Grace stood at the window, her face pressed against the glass, watching him intently. Her amber eyes tracked his every move, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. James chuckled softly. "Guess you're keeping an eye on me, huh?" he muttered, stepping back inside and kicking the snow from his boots. The rest of the day passed in a gentle rhythm. Grace seemed to grow more comfortable in the cabin, her movements less hesitant and her eyes softer when they met James's. Chance, though still fragile, was clearly growing stronger, his playful antics bringing life to the quiet room. James found himself talking to them as he went about his day, his voice filling the space that had once been so silent. "You've got quite the little personality," he said to Chance as the puppy attempted to gnaw on the corner of a blanket. "And you," he added, glancing at Grace, "you're braver than you look." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world outside turned a deep, shadowed blue, James settled by the fire with a book in hand. Grace lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, her gaze following him as he turned the pages. Chance was curled against her side, his tiny body rising and falling with each peaceful breath. James found it difficult to focus on the words in front of him. His mind kept drifting to the scene before him, the quiet companionship that had filled the emptiness he'd grown so used to. For the first time in what felt like forever, the cabin felt less like a place of isolation and more like a home. As the fire crackled and the room grew dim, James closed his book and let out a contented sigh. "We're going to be okay," he said softly. The words meant as much for himself as for them. Grace's ears twitched, and for a brief moment, she lifted her head to meet his gaze. There was something in her eyes, a quiet understanding, a shared recognition of second chances. And in that moment, James knew he wasn't alone anymore. The days that followed were a blur of quiet routines and cautious discoveries. Grace, though still thin and frail, had begun to move with a purpose that seemed stronger with each passing hour. Her amber eyes followed James wherever he went, tracking his movements as if trying to piece together the puzzle of this strange man who had taken her and Chance into his home. She was wary but not fearful, her cautious demeanor a testament to a past that likely hadn't been kind. Chance, on the other hand, was all boundless energy in a tiny, fragile frame. He wobbled around the living room with newfound confidence, his little legs carrying him on short adventures that often ended in an uncoordinated tumble. Each time Grace would rush to his side, nudging him back onto his feet with a motherly urgency that made James smile. In the evenings, James would sit by the fire, his work-weary hands stroking Grace's coat as she rested beside him. Her body was still far too thin, her ribs visible beneath her golden fur, but there was a resilience in her eyes that seemed to grow each day. She didn't flinch when he touched her anymore, though her posture remained alert, as if she were always prepared to spring into action should danger arise. James found himself talking to her more often than he expected, his voice soft and unhurried, as if trying to coax her into understanding that she was safe now. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, girl?" he'd murmur, his hand moving in slow circles along her back. Grace's ears would twitch at the sound of his voice, and sometimes, if he was lucky, she would let out a soft sigh, her head lowering to rest against his leg. Chance was a different sort of distraction. The puppy's endless curiosity kept James on his toes, from the way Chance tried to climb onto the sofa to the mischievous habit he'd developed of nosing through James's boots by the door. It wasn't long before James began to notice how much brighter the cabin felt with the two of them there. The once quiet space, filled only with the sounds of the fire and the occasional creak of the old wood, was now alive with the soft patter of paws and the tiny yips of a puppy discovering the world. James realized with a quiet sense of wonder that he no longer dreaded waking up to the stillness of another day. One morning, while sipping his coffee by the window, James watched Grace and Chance playing near the hearth. Chance had found an old sock James had tossed aside and was wrestling with it, growling in his high-pitched, puppyish way. Grace watched him with a patient amusement, her tail thumping softly against the floor. The sight warmed James's heart, and he found himself reaching for his camera, something he hadn't touched in years. The device felt unfamiliar in his hands, its weight a reminder of another life, one where he and Emily had spent weekends capturing the beauty of snowfields, mountains, and rivers. James lifted the camera and aimed it at the scene, the soft click of the shutter breaking the quiet. Grace's ears perked up at the sound, her head tilting in curiosity. "It's okay," James said with a small smile. "Just capturing the moment." Later that afternoon, James decided to test Grace's trust. The weather had cleared, the sky a bright, cloudless blue that seemed to stretch forever over the snow-covered ground. It was a good day for a walk, he thought, and perhaps a chance to see if Grace was ready to explore beyond the cabin. He pulled on his boots and jacket, grabbing an old leash he'd found in the back of a drawer. "What do you think, Grace?" he asked, holding the leash out for her to see. She eyed it warily, her posture stiffening. "It's not to hurt you," he assured her, crouching down and speaking softly. "Just so we can go out together." He waited, letting her sniff the leash before slowly clipping it to the makeshift collar he'd fashioned for her. Grace didn't resist, though her body remained tense as they stepped outside. The cold air was sharp but invigorating, the sunlight reflecting off the snow in a blinding brilliance. Grace stayed close to James as they walked, her steps hesitant at first but growing steadier with each passing minute. Chance followed at their feet, bounding clumsily through the snow, his tiny body sinking with each step. James couldn't help but laugh at the sight, the sound unfamiliar in his own ears, but genuine. "You're a brave one, little guy," he said, scooping Chance up to save him from the deeper drifts. Grace's gaze flicked to her puppy, her expression softening as she walked beside James. As they ventured further from the cabin, James noticed how Grace's demeanor began to change. Her ears perked up, and her nose twitched as she sniffed the air, her eyes scanning the horizon with an alertness that spoke of instincts honed by survival. When they reached the edge of the woods, Grace paused, her body tensing as her gaze fixed on a distant point among the trees. James followed her line of sight but saw nothing. "What is it, girl?" he asked, his voice low. Grace didn't move for a moment, her muscles taut, before she finally relaxed and looked back at him. James gave her a reassuring pat. "It's okay. We're safe." Back at the cabin, James unclipped the leash and watched as Grace settled back by the fire, her posture more at ease than it had been in days. Chance, exhausted from his adventure, curled up beside her, his tiny paws twitching as he drifted into sleep. James sat down nearby, his gaze lingering on the pair. He felt a sense of quiet accomplishment, a reassurance that they were beginning to trust him in their new home. For the first time since Emily's death, James allowed himself to feel hopeful. That evening, as the firelight flickered against the walls, James found himself opening up in a way he hadn't in years. Sitting on the floor beside Grace, he began to talk, his words spilling out in a soft, steady stream. He told her about Emily, about the life they'd built together, and the loss that had left him hollow. Grace listened, her amber eyes fixed on him, with an intensity that felt almost human. James chuckled softly, his voice breaking. "You probably think I'm crazy, talking to you like this," he said, "but it feels good, like I'm not alone anymore." Grace shifted closer, her head resting on his knee, her warm, steady presence a quiet affirmation. As the night deepened, James felt a sense of peace settle over the cabin. Grace and Chance slept soundly by the fire, their breathing soft and rhythmic. James sat back, his gaze drifting to the window where the moonlight cast long shadows over the snow. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't dread the dawn. Instead, he welcomed it, knowing that Grace and Chance would be there to greet him, their presence a reminder that even in the coldest winters, life could find a way to bloom again. As winter began to loosen its icy grip, the snow that had cloaked the landscape for months softened and shrank under the tentative warmth of the spring sun. James stood on the porch, sipping his morning coffee as he surveyed the world awakening around him. The once stark white expanse was giving way to patches of brown earth and the first hints of green. But what held his attention was the sight of Grace and Chance exploring the yard. Grace moved with a quiet confidence now, her gait no longer hesitant but steady and assured. Her coat, once dull and matted, had taken on a healthy sheen under James's care, while Chance had grown into a rambunctious ball of energy, bounding through the patches of snow like it was his own private playground. The sight filled James with a deep, quiet satisfaction that warmed him more than the coffee ever could. He had come to cherish these moments, the simplicity of sharing his life with Grace and Chance. They were his family now, a truth he'd come to accept fully during one particularly quiet evening when the cabin had seemed filled with a peace he hadn't felt since Emily's passing. The dogs had brought life back into his home, and in return, James had found himself stepping into a role he hadn't known he needed. That of a caregiver, a protector, someone with a purpose. It wasn't a replacement for the love he'd lost, but it was a balm for the ache, a reason to keep moving forward. That afternoon, James decided to expand their routine. The snow had receded enough to reveal the trails winding through the nearby woods, paths James and Emily had often walked together. He hadn't ventured out there since her death, the memories too raw, but something about the way Grace seemed to thrive in the open air, her energy contagious, gave him the courage to return. "What do you think, Grace?" he asked, clipping the leash to her collar. She looked up at him, her amber eyes steady, as if to say she was ready. Chance barked eagerly, bouncing on his small paws as if he understood the excitement in the air. They set off together, the path winding beneath tall pines that still held patches of snow in their shadowed branches. Grace walked at James's side, her steps purposeful but calm, while Chance darted back and forth on the trail, sniffing at every leaf and stick like each one was a new treasure. James couldn't help but laugh at his antics, the sound echoing through the trees. It felt good to laugh, to feel the fresh air fill his lungs as sunlight filtered through the branches, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of light. He felt lighter with every step, as though the weight of his grief was finally starting to ease. They reached a small clearing where the trail split, one path leading deeper into the woods and the other curving back toward home. Grace paused here, her nose lifting to catch the scents carried on the breeze. James watched her with quiet admiration. She was alert, her ears swiveling slightly, her tail still but relaxed. In that moment, she looked every bit the strong and capable creature she was, a far cry from the trembling, half-frozen dog he'd found on his porch. "You've come a long way, haven't you, girl?" he murmured. Grace glanced at him, her gaze softening before she nudged his hand with her nose. James chuckled, scratching behind her ears. "Yeah, me too." As they made their way back, James's mind drifted to the future. He hadn't allowed himself to think much about it in the past, but now, with Grace and Chance by his side, it felt less daunting. He imagined longer walks in the summer, maybe even a trip to the lake where Emily had loved to fish. He pictured Chance growing into a strong, spirited dog, his playful energy tempered by Grace's steadying influence. The thought brought a smile to his face. For the first time in years, the days ahead felt like something to look forward to, not just endure. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, James found himself sitting on the porch steps, Grace at his side and Chance curled up in his lap. The warmth of their presence was as tangible as the fading sunlight, and James felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He reached down to stroke Grace's head, his fingers brushing the soft fur between her ears. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. Grace looked up at him, her amber eyes reflecting the twilight, and James swore there was understanding in her gaze. The weeks turned into months, and spring unfolded in full, painting the landscape in vibrant greens and bursts of wildflowers. The trio settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as the changing seasons. James took to documenting their adventures with his old camera, snapping photos of Chance leaping through tall grass or Grace standing sentinel at the edge of the forest, her figure framed by the golden light of dusk. The cabin, once so quiet and filled with shadows, was now a place of life and laughter, its walls echoing with the sounds of paws skittering across the floor and the occasional bark of excitement. One day, as they were exploring a trail near the river, Grace stopped abruptly, her nose to the ground. James watched as she began digging, her movements deliberate but urgent. When she finally unearthed a small weathered object, James crouched beside her to see what she had found. It was an old leather collar, its surface cracked and worn by time. James turned it over in his hands, his fingers brushing against the faint imprint of a name that had long since faded. He looked at Grace, who stood quietly beside him, her gaze steady and unreadable. "Is this yours?" he asked softly, though he knew she couldn't answer. The collar felt like a relic of her past, a piece of the story she couldn't tell him. James tucked it into his pocket, a quiet promise to honor the journey that had brought her here. As the sun began to set, James, Grace, and Chance made their way back to the cabin. The light of the fireplace spilled through the windows, a beacon of warmth against the deepening blue of twilight. Inside, James prepared their dinner, the simple ritual now a source of joy rather than a chore. Grace and Chance waited patiently by the fire, their silhouettes outlined by its golden glow. As James joined them, sitting on the floor with his plate in hand, he felt a contentment that was rare and precious. That night, as the fire burned low and the room grew quiet, James sat with Grace and Chance beside him, their steady presence a comfort he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. He thought of Emily and the life they had shared, and for the first time, the memories didn't feel like a weight but a gift, a reminder of the love that had shaped him and the new love that now filled his home. "We're a good team," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that matched the fire. Grace shifted closer, her head resting on his knee, and Chance let out a contented sigh as he curled into a ball. In the quiet stillness of the cabin, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The storm that had once raged in his heart had passed, leaving in its wake a quiet strength and the promise of brighter days ahead.